The bay door opens, and a dry wind rushes into the company dropship. Inside, the crew waits with bated breath as the ship slowly descends to the surface of an exomoon on the fringe of developed space. As they make their way onto the ship's external catwalk, a sense of anxiousness permeates the dry air as below them, to the left, a facility comes into view. One quite unlike any other facility this crew has ever laid eyes on before. In front of them sit 4 warehouses, aligned in a 2x2 grid pattern, and beyond that, a concrete building with few, if any, discernible external features. The atmosphere here is still and eerily calm. As the group works their way past the warehouses, they spot several towering machines that appear to be decommissioned robots, left behind by the moon's former inhabitants tens or even hundreds of years earlier. And once inside, it's apparent that gambling on the 1,500 credit price tag to access this moon was definitely worthwhile. The moon is laden with valuables, from goblets to rings to exotic perfumes and even gold bars. And as the day draws close to its end, all 4 crew members, reinvigorated by their valuable finds, meet at the main exit. Together, they gather the loot and prepare for the short jaunt back to the ship, a successful end to a successful day. Or so it would seem. At nightfall, this moon, known as 68 Artifice, will become a very different place. At sundown, those metal husks, thought long since inoperative, lurch to unnatural life. Now they bombard the crew with missiles, and while some perish, this is still a preferable fate to those who are instead grabbed in the automaton's iron grip and charred to a husk by the bot's super-hot flame. Come morning, the surface of Artifice will look as if the events of the day prior never took place at all. As daylight approaches, these massive machines, the old birds, will resume their slumber, and nobody in the Thistle Nebula will be any the wiser as to the whereabouts of the crew, just a statistic, another set of casualties incurred through work at the company. But these machines, the old birds, where did they come from? What are they? And how are they significant to the overall story and lore of Lethal Company? Well, today, that's precisely what we're going to discuss, because having been added to the game with the release of the very recent version 50, the old birds are easily the most robust and lore-rich creatures ever added to the game. This is the full lore of the old birds, Lethal Company's most brutal and unforgiving enemies. But before we get into the old birds themselves, let's briefly recap the update that brought them into existence. Version 50 of Lethal Company is almost certainly the most robust content update this game has ever had, adding 3 new moons and 2 new enemies to the experience, as well as a whole slew of balance changes to existing material. Version 50 is really the first update of its kind. Never before has a new moon been added to the game through a content update, much less 3 of them. And with a 4th discovered in the game code, it seems there's even more to come in the future. What's more though, version 50 also demonstrates a new side of Lethal Company lore, a seeming commitment by Zeekers, the game's creator, to a more hyper-diegetic, overarching story. Hell, this update even comes with an opening cutscene. The point is that this update is as lore-rich as Lethal Company has really ever been, and it all starts with a trip to an entirely new moon. 68 Wait, no, hold on, that's not right. 20 adamants. Yeah, I know I opened this video talking about Artifice, but hear me out, because if it wasn't for adamants, we wouldn't even know about Artifice's existence in the first place. Up until now, there have always been a total of 9 moons to visit in Lethal Company. 41 Experimentation, 220 Assurance, and 56 Vow, which are easy moons, the medium worlds, 21 Offense and 61 March, the hard moons, 85 Rend, 7 Dine, and 8 Titan, as well as the Company moon, 71 Gordian. With the release of version 50 though, crew members will now see adamants alongside Offense and March in the medium slot. And, as it turns out, adamants and March are similar not just in their difficulty level, but also in the way they present their environment. When viewing the surface of adamants from above, it's plain to see how a pattern of harsh weathering has modified this landscape. Like the other forest moons, adamants is certainly among the more topographically diverse places we can visit, and this is reflected perhaps nowhere better than with the vast central pit in the middle of the area. Travel directly through this impression is a popular option for those loaded up with scrap, when the collapsible bridge nearby is unlikely to hold, but our interest today lies in a very specific feature of the landscape down here in particular, in the form of this small wooden shed. By default, the door to this cabin will always be locked, but it can be unlocked with a standard key, just like any other found throughout your travels. When opened, you'll be able to access the cabin just the same as any other unlocked door for the rest of the day, but much like the cabin found on Rend, there's not much to see inside. That is, unless you visit the back room, where the number 68 and the word art are scrawled in large text across the wall. These are also visible from the outside of the cabin, though not as clearly as when viewed from within, and truthfully, aside from this code, or potentially the use of this cabin as a pit stop between the facility and the ship when hostile creatures are around, there's not much reason to visit here again, but chances are you've already figured out where we're headed. Typing art into the terminal offers us the option to route to 68 Artifice, the moon which we spoke of in the introduction of this video, and it's here that our story really begins. Immediately upon landing on Artifice, one will be greeted with an overwhelming sense of unease. Everywhere we turn, we see things that appear out of place. Empty warehouses with hangar doors ajar, rows of hospital beds left where they stand, and even a hole hurriedly carved through the perimeter fence, perhaps a sign of a hasty getaway sometime in the past. Combined with the omnipresence of slumbering old birds and the exceptional amount of loot found in the moon's interior, it's not hard to wonder as to just what went on here. This question will prove to be an enduring one throughout our exploration, but there's more than enough context clues to hint toward a couple of different solutions, all of which come from one place. A resource that is in many ways the main focus of this video, the Old Bird's Bestiary entry. At the time of recording, this is the single longest piece of writing found in all of Lethal Company, and for good reason. This is a very dense piece of text that contains revelation after revelation in rapid succession, and because of this, we're going to be reading through the log in its entirety, but piece by piece, dissecting each individual segment as we go. So, without further ado, let's get started. The Old Bird is an autonomous offensive weapon of war with a humanoid design. Measured at 19 feet tall and 11 feet wide, its two most defining visual features are the spotlight positioned on its head, capable of emitting 100,000 lumens, and the long-range acoustic device on its chest, sometimes referred to as a sound cannon. There are additional speakers on its shoulders used to broadcast sound a long distance. The Old Bird's left arm is a claw, and its right arm is a nozzle capable of both launching rocket-propelled grenades and torching, at close range, with a very hot flame. Old Birds are one of the first extra-orbital weapons to be used and mass-produced. The subject of who developed the Old Birds has been an intense debate since their first recorded appearance on... Oh boy. So I regret to inform you that as of recording in the version of this log that's committed to the main branch of Lethal Company, there's a massive cut in this section that really rather abruptly takes us out of the story here. I'm honestly not sure if this was a mistake or what, but when I was first writing this script, I was referencing the text seen in the beta version of Update 50, which itself underwent a number of changes here and there. At one point, there was even a bit of flavor text contributed by Sigurd, which has also since been removed for reasons that you're about to see, but in this older version, the origin story of the Old Birds was pretty well established, I thought, so although you should not consider this next part canon information, at least as long as it's not actually present in the game, I'm going to dig my heels in here, read over the section anyway, and say what I was going to say about it originally, since, well, there's a lot of lore here that seems to be intended for a couple of reasons that I'll highlight afterwards when we discuss. The subject of who developed the Old Birds has been an intense debate since their first recorded appearance on December 18th of 2143, when over 50 Old Birds invaded the Anglin capital. This is considered one of the first major causes of the downfall of the Anglin Empire. The most commonly upheld theory takes into account the tension between the Anglin and Bumok military throughout the 2100s. However, nothing has been definitively proven in the centuries since. Then this paragraph finishes out with a piece of text that is still in the final version of the log, so this next part you can consider canon information again, and it reads, "The design of the Old Bird, down to the tempering of metals, appears intended to conceal its origin. It has been called the Walking Ransom Letter." Unfortunately, this is pretty much all we have to go off of regarding the old bird's origins, which is too bad, since it's the first and last time we hear anything of the two forces mentioned here. But what is known is that both the Anglian Empire and the Beaumont were considered opposing or conflicting powers, at least to a degree. Though we don't know exactly what kinds of forces are at play here, we do know that the concept of interplanetary warfare in Lethal Company was hardly a new or novel thing by the point of the old bird's first appearance. According to Sigurd's log Real Job, the Moon 8 Titan was expected to go to war all the way back in or around 1968, though at present there's no evidence to suggest that Anglin or Beaumont would have been associated with this conflict, if they even existed at the time to begin with. I think this also correlates to the retcon of the text written by Sigurd in the earlier beta version of the entry. At one point, Sigurd was supposed to have attributed a danger level of 95% to the old bird, and supplied this piece of text at the end of the log. But having this in the lore as written would have presented a paradox. If we are to believe that the first recorded old bird encounter happened in 2143, then there's really no conceivable way that somebody working for the company in 1968 would have come across one, say nothing of writing about it. So I'm pretty well convinced that it's for this reason that mentions of Sigurd were removed from the log in the first place. Either way though, owing to the fact that the old birds are considered, quote, one of the first extra-orbital weapons to be used and mass-produced, it's clear that warfare in the 2100s would have looked drastically different from anything seen before, and, at least at the time, the old birds would have been on the cutting edge of next-generation combat, a notion expanded upon in the following paragraph. Old birds' legs function as rockets, which allow them to travel long distances and find targets efficiently, but the most likely reason this feature exists is to help them enter and land from orbit. The material and fuel old birds rely on is similar to those of passenger spacecraft from around 2130. Old birds land and stay at their target planet forever. Although they often have more than enough fuel for just one trip, no behavior has been found in their programming which suggests they could choose to migrate. Still, there are unverified accounts of old birds traveling autonomously to a new planet after hundreds of years of dormancy. The old bird was historically referred to as the AL, based on the code name it was given by the English military, the A-16L31. In 2384, however, the song Old Birds released as a cult hit by the post-punk project Under Remora. Just 3 years later, in his most famous work of the same name, street artist Land Erie depicted the automatons flying and landing between planets in an arrangement similar to a flock of geese. This is generally considered one of the most iconic and influential images of modern culture, and solidified the modern nickname. So it seems after their initial rise, the old birds continued to crop up in the Thistle Nebula intermittently for a period of around 200 to 300 years, and gained enough infamy in the process to warrant a level of recognition among everyday people. Another connection that seems to back up the idea of the old birds being somewhat well known throughout local space actually stems from something that was pointed out to me by one of my close friends during our time playing. He mentioned that the toy robot scrap item almost looks like a softer, more child-friendly rendition of an old bird itself, essentially positing the idea that the toy robot may be comparative to a plastic tank or a toy soldier, a mundane and normalized depiction of a symbol of war. In addition, if you spend any amount of time around one of the old birds when they're in their stalking phase, you'll know that these things are loud, and not only loud, but also uncanny, with the array of sounds that emanate from them being kind of concerning at times. Could it be that the laughing tones of the toy robot are meant to both mimic and simultaneously disarm the crying and the off-putting music that are so ubiquitously linked with the old birds at this point, in an attempt to make their likeness more accessible to children? It's very difficult to say definitively, but personally, I tend to think that my buddy might be onto something here. Regardless though, I think we can actually identify the exact point where the old birds really garnered their poor reputation. And, as you'd expect, we have a sizable amount of information to go off of in this regard, stemming from around 30 years before they garnered that now infamous name. In 2356, 5 Embrion was classified as condemned for the purpose of travel or settlement by the boat. Old birds are described by witness accounts as lining the horizon. Though to this day they appear inoperative, there is a reasonable risk that many are still in sleep mode, so the planet will likely keep its status. The small moon was likely used as a testing ground for the old bird's flying and landing capabilities. So I know that was a lot of information to swallow, but we've also gleaned more than a few important takeaways, and in case you haven't guessed yet, I think we can probably assume that the old birds are most likely responsible for the abandonment of 68 Artifice, if that was ever even a question to begin with. One look at the moon's info page makes it very apparent that Artifice was A, teeming with life, and B, host to technologies at least 2 centuries of age. This part's particularly interesting, as if we subtract the approximate time frame from 2532, which is the year in which we know that the Lethal Company takes place due to the first terminal startup screen, we end up with a time around 20 years before the condemnation of Embrion, which I tend to believe is actually pretty significant. Now to be clear, this next part is purely theoretical. There's nothing in the files from what I've seen that would overtly suggest that this may be true, but to me, this paragraph about Embrion reads as sort of reactionary. In other words, I can't help but feel like the decision to condemn the planet by the boat, which seems like some form of authoritative body on the subject of space travel and lunar colonization, may have largely been made in response to some other event, something that simply demanded to be addressed. Something like an accident or a tragedy. So could it be that Artifice was once host to some sort of lunar colony, but a sudden attack from hostile old birds may have resulted in heavy casualties and a desperate scramble that has since left the moon abandoned? Warehouses and facilities would have been quickly abandoned. Many may have fled with only what they had on their persons, leaving behind a lot of the heavier valuables that we can find throughout the interior of the moon. It also sort of explains the makeshift hospital, the last-ditch effort of a desperate few to care for the wounded somewhere, anywhere with cover. And, of course, it also serves to explain a hole punched through the side of an enclosing fence, the work, perhaps, of someone trapped inside this small wooden shed at the time of the attack. Too afraid to exit through the main door, they may have derived an alternative means of escape to meet with their fate outside of the facility limits, whatever that fate may be. It's kind of harrowing to think that this facility, left untouched for the better part of 200 years, may have potentially been abandoned in only a single day, or even a handful of hours. Years of work and progress wiped away in an instant. This is the raw power of the old birds. But that brings us to the matter of Embrion, a moon that's kind of name-dropped out of pretty much nowhere, and which, judging by its description, is heavily tied to the old birds in a fairly intimate way. Typing Embrion into the ship terminal gives you the option to route there for a mere 150 credits, and being as it is a navigable moon, it also has an info tab. Conditions. Desolate and flat with unbreathable air, Embryon's surface layer is almost entirely made of amethyst quartz, which is made possible by Embryon's distance to its nearest star and its resulting geothermal activity. The surface of Embrion is scorchingly hot. History. Embrion was discovered in just the last century. It appears to have been used as a testing ground for old birds long before it was officially discovered. As a result of this danger, its status has been marked as condemned. There are theories that a diverse geothermal ecosystem may be thriving within a vast cave network under Embryon's surface. Fauna. Embrion is devoid of biological life. Well, they certainly weren't kidding about any of that. While the inside of Embrion is generally normal, with a fairly typical loot and enemy table, the outside definitely lives up to its reputation as a hub for old bird activity. Not only are these metal monstrosities absolutely everywhere, but unlike Artifice, there's also virtually no cover to speak of, making Embrion nearly impossible to traverse at night whether or not you're burdened by loot. The oldest known location in canon associated with old bird technology, Embrion is a moon that I would doubt we ever learn much more about. In addition, I feel the need to reiterate that though Embrion was presumably used in flight testing, this hardly means that it was the place where these automata were actually engineered. Where and what the old bird homeworld is still a matter very much up for debate. With all that being said, make no mistake, Embrion and Artifice are hardly the only moons we know of in-game that can host the old birds. In fact, more than half of the moons that appear appear in the game have a chance, albeit a small one, for old birds to spawn, which is also something that we saw as being a potential narrative possibility within the Bestiary entry. Though in the written lore, the evidence to support old birds moving between planets after their initial arrival is purely colloquial, it is possible that these spawn rates are a further indication that there may be some truth behind this notion. Though, for a number of reasons, I would maintain that spawn rates alone aren't exactly enough to prove or disprove much of anything surrounding a lot of Lethal Company's monsters. In my view, they're circumstantial evidence at best, maybe something that could be an indication of more significant lore, but certainly not enough to constitute that in its own right, so I suppose make of this what you will. And in terms of what's said about these creatures in the game, that's actually pretty much it. As you can see, the old birds definitely have a more long and winding history than many of the other enemy encounters in the game, though they certainly retain their own share of mystery as well. I can't help but get the feeling that this is not the last we've seen or heard of the old birds, and in fact, even beyond what we've spoken of today, there's undoubtedly still more to uncover regarding these things. One particular area of interest that still has yet to be fully explored is the rather jarring sound effects associated with the old bird's active hunting state. There's a lot of different sounds that can be observed when an old bird is chasing down prey, whether it be a crewmate or otherwise, and all of them have, well, let's just say, rather suspect names within the game files. Although the names of in-game files are certainly not canon, it does leave something to the imagination, and it's at this point that I really need to thank a good friend of the channel, Chicken Nougat, for bringing a lot of this stuff to my attention. As a matter of fact, if you'd like to hear a slightly more analytical and data-driven breakdown of the old birds, including but not limited to a dive into the sound effects that I just mentioned, then I would highly recommend checking out the video on his channel, Old Birds, Lethal Company's Deadliest Enemies. It's linked in the description, as is his channel. If you find that interesting, then he's also put out another similar video cataloging each and every file in the version 50 beta concerning as of yet unreleased Moon 44 liquidation. Basically, if there's anything you could hope to know about upcoming content from the perspective of a data miner, then Chicken Nougat probably is your guy. Definitely go check him out. He's put a lot of work into bringing this stuff forward, and I hope that you'll decide to go over and support his channel a bit. That's pretty much all I wanted to say at the end of this one, other than the fact that, well, I hope you enjoyed this video too. Once again, thanks for watching today. Special thanks to those of you who are still sticking around here until the end. This is Everberon. I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.